They said the land was dead, that nothing could grow there again, not crops, not dreams, not even second chances. But then came a woman with nothing left to lose, and a quiet mechanic who had long stopped believing in beginnings. What they planted together wasn't just seeds, it was faith, faith that the soil could heal, and so could they. But when neighbors laughed and storms rolled in, would kindness and grit be enough to bring a forgotten farm and two broken hearts back to life? If stories of hope, quiet strength, and second chances speak to something in your soul, you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this heartwarming journey. Because some stories aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be felt. Now, let's begin. A poor mechanic repaired her tractor to help revive a dead farm. Neighbors mocked them until harvest. The sign outside Eli Turner's garage had long lost its shine. The red paint had chipped away with the years, and the Turner's repairs letters now leaned like tired shoulders after a long day. Still, every morning at 6, Eli slid open the creaky metal door and started the coffee pot, like he had every day since his father passed. He didn't expect visitors. Most folks in the valley had newer machines or gave up trying. The last real rush of work had been 3 springs ago, when a neighbor's baler broke down mid-season. Since then, it was mostly rusted chainsaws and the occasional lawnmower that needed coaxing back to life. So when the battered pickup rumbled into the gravel lot just before noon, trailing a cloud of dust and towing an even more battered tractor, Eli squinted up from his bench and blinked against the sun. The truck came to a hissing stop. The door opened. A woman stepped out, brown hair tied in a loose bun, denim jacket, faded at the shoulders, boots caked with travel and something heavier. She moved with purpose, but her eyes carried the weariness of someone who'd been carrying too much for too long. "Hi," she said, voice firm but cautious. "You Eli?" He nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's me." "I'm Rachel. Moore. I just moved into the old Crane farm, up the road." Eli's eyebrows lifted. The Crane place had been deadland for years, nothing but dust and dried-up irrigation lines. She followed his glance. "Yeah, everyone says I'm crazy." He gave a slight shrug. "Most good things start that way." A ghost of a smile tugged at her lips. She gestured toward the relic behind her. "The tractor came with the place. Doesn't run, won't even cough. I was told you're the only one around who might have a shot." Eli walked past her and gave the machine a slow circle. The engine was seized, the tires were cracked, and rust had eaten its way through half the frame. He whistled low. Rachel stood behind him, arms folded like a shield. "I don't have much money," she said quickly, "but if you could just look at it, I could pay a little now, more later, or work it off." Eli didn't answer right away. He crouched beside the engine and ran his fingers along the dented housing like a doctor feeling for a pulse. "Won't be easy," he muttered. "She's been neglected." "Haven't we all?" Rachel said too quickly, then looked away. That was when Eli looked at her for real, not just the boots and jacket and chapped hands, but the woman herself. There was grit there, and something else, something aching and brave. He stood. "Leave it here. I'll take a look." Relief flooded her face, then hesitation. "You're sure?" He gave a single nod. "I've worked on worse, and the coffee's free if you want to wait a while." She blinked, as if unsure whether it was an offer or a joke. "I could use a minute out of the sun." Inside the garage, the smell of motor oil, old wood, and fresh coffee mingled in a strangely comforting mix. Rachel sat on a stool by the workbench, watching Eli as he laid out tools with practiced ease. "You work alone?" she asked. He nodded. "Been that way a long time." "Family. Used to be," he said simply. The wrench slipped once in his grip, catching the edge of his knuckle. He didn't flinch, just wiped the blood on a rag and kept going. Outside, the wind kicked up, rattling the tin roof. Rachel sipped the coffee he poured her and looked around. The place was worn but neat, loved in the way old barns were loved, not polished but understood. "What made you take on the Crane place?" Eli asked, not looking up. She set the mug down gently. "It was left to me. My father owned it. We hadn't spoken in years." He gave a slow nod, as if he already understood. "I needed a place," she added. "A fresh start. For me. And my son." Eli finally met her eyes. "How?" "Old 8. He's staying with my sister until I get things settled." They didn't speak for a while after that. Just the clink of tools and the hum of an old radio playing somewhere in the background. By the time the sun had moved past the roofline, Eli wiped sweat from his brow and stepped back from the machine. "Try it now." Rachel looked at him, startled. "What?" "The ignition. Try it." She climbed into the seat, hesitant, turned the key. At first nothing, then a click, then a cough, then the deep, gravelly growl of an engine that remembered how to live. Rachel stared ahead, stunned. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. Then, without warning, she laughed, full and bright and disbelieving. Her eyes filled with tears, and she jumped down from the cab. How did you—" Eli shrugged again, rubbing his hands on the rag. "Just needed someone to believe it could still run." Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She looked at him like she was seeing more than just a mechanic, like she saw the quiet, weathered soul behind the grease-stained coveralls. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You just did," he said. And with that she climbed back into her truck, waving once before pulling out into the gravel drive. The tractor followed behind, like an old friend returning home. Eli stood in the dust cloud long after they were gone, hands in his pockets, the sound of the engine still echoing in his ears. The wind rustled through the dry cottonwoods, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel quite so alone. The road leading to the old Crane farm was more memory than gravel, rutted, sun-baked, lined with weeds that had claimed it long before Rachel Moore had driven her truck through for the first time. The place sat at the end of a narrow valley, flanked by low hills and weathered fence posts that leaned like old men tired of standing. Eli had driven this road once before, years ago, back when his father was still alive and still believed in second chances. He hadn't set foot past the rusted gate since, but now the gate creaked open before him, and Rachel stood just beyond it, waving him through. She wore the same denim jacket from yesterday, now dusted with dirt. Behind her, the farmhouse sagged, under the weight of time, its white paint peeling, its porch half swallowed by overgrown vines. "Didn't expect you this early," she called as he parked beside the barn. "I wanted to make sure the tractor was running all right," Eli said, stepping down from his truck. "And I was curious," she raised an eyebrow, "curious about the kind of person who chooses this." He gestured around them, the crumbling barn, the cracked earth, the acres of brittle soil reaching toward a cloudless sky. Rachel glanced at it all, her gaze lingering on the horizon, as if willing something green to grow. "Everyone says it's dead land," she said, "but it wasn't always." Eli followed her as she walked toward the barn. Inside, the smell of rot and hay drifted up like old ghosts. A few tools hung crooked on rusted nails. Cobwebs bridged the rafters. Dust clung to everything. "I used to visit when I was little," Rachel said, her voice softer here. "Before things got complicated, my dad would stand out there in the fields swearing the soil still had something left to give. Then one year everything failed, crops dried out, the well ran low. He blamed everyone but himself." Eli studied her profile, strong but laced with an old sadness. "And now you're back." She turned to him, crossing her arms. "I figured I'd either fix it or fall with it. Either way, I'd know I tried." He nodded, silently respecting the choice. Then he walked over to the tractor, now parked in the open air like a monument. It still looked like a rusted relic, but beneath the scars it purred with a faint hum of possibility. "Tractor's fine," he said, "but machines only go so far." Rachel let out a dry laugh. "That's what I keep telling myself." They walked the length of the field together. What had once been neat rows of corn and beans was now a patchwork of hard soil and stubborn weeds. Here and there, faded signs of irrigation lines peeked through the ground. Nothing had grown in years. "I've got a few seeds left from my sister," Rachel said, "and an old manual on crop rotation. I figure even failure can be informative." "Failure usually is," Eli said, his boots crunching over gravel. "It's just not always kind." They stopped at the edge of what looked like a dried-up irrigation trench. Eli crouched, scooping up a handful of dirt and letting it sift through his fingers. It was dry, yes, but not dead. "This can work," he said quietly, "with time and a little water." Rachel knelt beside him, brushing hair from her face. "I thought maybe you'd say I was wasting mine." "I've wasted more time doing nothing," he said, standing. This at least feels honest." There was a pause. Then, as if the weight of the moment was too much, she smiled faintly. "You ever farmed, Eli?" "Once," he said. "With my father. Just a few rows of tomatoes behind the shop. But I remember the feeling when they came in, like we'd managed to cheat the world for a minute." Rachel nodded. "That's what I want. Just one honest season." They returned to the barn, and Rachel showed him a map she'd sketched. Rough. Plots of where she planned to till, where to try squash, maybe herbs if she could find the right soil treatment. Eli didn't say much, but he pointed out better positions for sun exposure, mentioned a trick or two for natural drainage. He moved slowly, deliberately, more like someone trying to repair a clock than till a field. Rachel watched him, noting the care in his movements, the way he treated her dreams like they mattered. Later they sat on the farmhouse porch, each with a glass of water gone warm in the sun. The breeze stirred the dry leaves, and the sky above stretched wide and unbothered. "People will laugh," Rachel said quietly. "They already are." Eli stared out over the empty fields. "Let 'em. You don't mind being the butt of the joke?" "I've been that for years," he said, "but I'd rather be laughed at for trying than pitied for sitting still." She looked at him differently then, not just as the mechanic who'd fixed her tractor, but as someone who might just understand what it felt like to stand in a ruin and still see a home. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the porch. Rachel leaned back in her chair, eyes closed for just a moment. "You ever think," she murmured, "that maybe the land isn't the only thing that needs reviving?" Eli didn't answer, but he stayed a little longer that evening, and for the first time in a long time, Rachel didn't feel entirely alone. The third morning, Eli showed up without being asked. Rachel was already outside, kneeling in the garden bed behind the house, trying to convince a stubborn hose to cooperate with the rusted spigot. Her shirt clung to her back in the rising heat, and her knees were stained with soil. When she looked up, Eli was standing by his truck, a coil of new hose slung over one shoulder. "I figured yours might be older than the house," he said. Setting it down, Rachel blinked. "How'd you even know?" "I didn't, just a hunch." She stared at the new hose, then back at him. "I can't pay you for that. Didn't ask you to." Rachel exhaled slowly, biting back the instinct to argue. "You do this for everyone?" "No," he said without hesitation, then added, "just the ones who show up and fight the dirt." She laughed despite herself. "Well, there's a compliment, hidden in there somewhere." They worked in silence for a while, Eli replacing the old spigot with a newer fitting, Rachel digging rows with a short-handled hoe that had seen better decades. By mid-morning, sweat glistened on their foreheads, and the sun beat down like it had something to prove. Eli paused to sip from a water jug. "You're not easing into this, are you?" Rachel wiped her brow. "I don't really know how to ease into things. It's always been jump or don't." He glanced at the uneven rows she was carving into the hard ground. They weren't perfect, but they were honest. "What are you planting?" he asked. "Beans, mostly. Some squash, a few tomatoes, whatever seeds I could find that weren't $10 a packet. You'll want to rotate next season. I'll be lucky if there is a next season." Eli didn't answer. Instead, he knelt beside her, pressed his thumb into the soil. "Still dry underneath. You'll want to soak it deep today, early morning and again before sunset." Rachel nodded, absorbing the advice like gospel. She was good at listening, one of the quiet traits that made Eli feel oddly at ease around her. Just before noon, as they laid compost along the rows, the sound of a truck engine echoed down the drive. Rachel stood, brushing her hands on her jeans as the vehicle slowed near the gate. It was an old Ford, blue paint faded and dented, with two men inside, local boys. One of them leaned out the window, grinning. "You planting a garden or digging a grave out there, Miss Moore?" Rachel didn't respond. "You know that land won't grow nothing but weeds," the other added. "My uncle tried. Ended up selling it for scrap." Eli stood beside Rachel now, hands loose at his sides, face unreadable. "You boys need something?" he asked, voice calm. They looked at him, took in the quiet mechanic with his grease-stained shirt and lined face, and hesitated. "No harm meant," the driver mumbled, tapping the side of the truck. "Just wondering. If y'all need a reality check." Then they drove off in a blur of laughter and dust. Rachel stood still for a long moment, her face a mixture of anger and shame. Eli said nothing. Instead, he walked back to the row, picked up the hoe, and began. "Working again." She watched him. "You don't even flinch," she said. "I've been called worse. Don't you ever want to scream at them?" He paused, looked up at her. "What for? Noise never grew anything. Work might." Her chest tightened, not from the insult, but from how familiar the feeling was. That sick twist of doubt after someone held up a mirror to your hope and called it foolish. "I thought I was ready for this," she said quietly. "But some days I feel like a kid dressing up in overalls, playing pretend." Eli straightened, rested the hoe on his shoulder. "Everyone's pretending, Rachel. Some of us just stick with it long enough for it to look real." She laughed softly, a dry, bitter sound, then sighed. "You ever think I'm crazy for trying this?" "All the time," he said with a straight face. "But I admire it." She blinked at him. "You admire crazy? I admire people who plant seeds in dust. Takes guts." They worked until the sun dropped low, golden light softening the edges of the broken barn and the crooked fence posts. Together, they lined the garden rows with straw to hold in moisture. It wasn't much, a dozen rows, give or take, but it was something. At the end of the day, Rachel poured 2 glasses of lemonade and joined Eli on the front porch. The air was still warm, but not harsh. A breeze danced through the fields, tugging gently at the dry grass. "I haven't had help like this in a long time," she said, her voice quiet. "I haven't given it in a while either," he replied. They sat in silence, watching the sun sink behind the hills, casting long shadows over the land that had once been written off as lost. But it didn't feel lost now. It felt waiting. Rachel turned to him. "Why are you really doing this, Eli?" He took a slow sip from his glass. "Because something about this place feels like it might come back to life. And so do you." She stared at him for a long second, then smiled. Small, honest, a little unsure. "That's a lot of faith," she said. He nodded. "One of us has to believe." The air in town always smelled different than it did out at the farm. Less earth, more asphalt and exhaust. Eli had never cared for it. He made quick trips, a bolt here, a jug of oil there, maybe a pack of coffee if the jar was getting low. He wasn't one for lingering, but that morning, as he stood in line at Miller's Hardware with a bag of fertilizer and a replacement coupling for Rachel's leaky irrigation valve, he could feel the stares. not the friendly kind. Back in business. "Turner?" someone said behind him. Eli didn't turn, just handed a 20 to the cashier and waited for his change. "Word is, you've been fixing more than just tractors these days," the voice continued, taunting, amused. He turned slowly. It was Dale Renshaw, same smug face from high school, only rounder now. His gut pressed against his belt like it had something to prove. Behind him stood Marla and Kenny from the feed store, both pretending not to listen too hard. "I help where I'm needed," Eli said simply. Sure, Dale said, grinning. "Just funny is all. You fixing up that old place like it's going to turn into Eden. Thought you were smarter than that?" Eli met his gaze, unwavering. "Better to fix what's broken than sit around laughing at it." Dale opened his mouth for another jab, but Eli had already turned away. Back at the farm, the sun was high and unrelenting. Rachel was by the chicken coop, what used to be one anyway, sorting through warped boards and bent nails, trying to see what could be salvaged. "Brought the coupling," Eli said, setting the bag on the porch. Rachel wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Perfect timing. The leak's getting worse. They walked the perimeter together, checking the water lines, marking spots that needed patching. The soil, still dry, was darkening in spots where moisture had finally begun to take hold. The beans had sprouted, just green whispers for now, but alive. Rachel knelt beside one, smiling faintly. "They're growing," Eli crouched beside her. "Told you," she glanced sideways. "Not bad for two fools with more heart than sense." Eli didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the soil, but his thoughts seemed elsewhere. Rachel nudged him. "What?" "I stopped by town this morning," he said. "Picked up supplies." He straightened. "How'd that go?" He looked at her then. "They're talking." Rachel's jaw tightened. "Let me guess. Something about the crazy lady trying to grow tomatoes on a dust bowl. And the fool helping her." She exhaled, sat back on her heels. "I don't know why it still gets to me. I thought I was past caring." They laugh. "Because it's easier than trying," Eli said. "They see failure before the seed even cracks." Rachel fell quiet for a while. The wind rustled through the dried corn stalks left behind by some long-gone season. "You know," she said, "when I first got here, I told myself I didn't care what people thought, that I'd build something out of this place, or die trying. You still believe that?" "I'm trying to." Her voice wavered. "But it's hard. Every snicker, every stare. It chips away at that belief." Eli nodded, brushing dirt from his palms. "Then we keep planting." She looked at him. "Every day they laugh, we plant another row," he continued. "Every time they doubt, we fix another pipe, mend another fence. Until there's nothing left for them to mock, just green fields where there used to be dust." Rachel blinked. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but something harder to name. Maybe resolve, maybe something beginning to root. Later that day, while Eli repaired the irrigation valve, Rachel returned to town to pick up feed for the hens she hoped to raise. She kept her chin up in the feed store, even when Marla's eyes followed her like a fly on glass. At the checkout, the clerk, an older man named Roy, looked at her with a soft kind of confusion. "You Moore's girl?" he asked. Rachel nodded. Bracing herself, Roy didn't say anything for a moment. Then he slid her receipt across the counter. "Your dad never made that land work," he said. "But that doesn't mean you won't." Rachel froze. "You knew my father. We all did. Hard man, proud, but you're not him." She left the store with the feed and a strange flutter in her chest. Not quite hope, but not despair either. Back at the farm, the sun was beginning to set. Eli had finished with the valve and was refilling the water tank with a quiet diligence that had come to feel like home. Rachel handed him a cold bottle of lemonade. "Roy at the feed store said I'm not my father." Eli took the bottle. "You're not. I've just spent so long trying to outrun his shadow, I forget I'm not standing in it." Eli nodded. Maybe you're not meant to run. Maybe you're meant to grow right where he failed." She didn't reply, just looked out at the field where green had begun to interrupt the brown. It wasn't much, but it was real. They sat on the porch again that evening, the sky turning soft orange and lavender. A mockingbird sang from the old oak, and the air smelled like dust cooling after a long day's work. Rachel sipped her drink, then turned to Eli. "If they keep laughing," she asked, "will you still show up?" Eli didn't even hesitate. "Every morning," she smiled, tired but genuine. "Then I'll keep planting." By the time July settled into the valley, the sun had grown fierce and unrelenting. It bore down like a weight, pressing into the soil, baking every inch of the old farm until even the shadows seemed too tired to move. But Eli and Rachel kept working. Each day began at dawn. Rachel would emerge from the house in her boots and sun hat, a cup of coffee warming her hands. Eli would arrive a few minutes later, already dusted in the scent of oil and iron, carrying whatever tools or spare parts he thought the day might require. Their conversation was brief at first, simple updates on irrigation, compost, pests, but there was comfort in the rhythm. They moved like a pair who had long since stopped needing to narrate every step. The garden had grown, messy but promising. Squash blossoms opened like yellow trumpets in the early light. The bean plants reached for their makeshift trellises, vines curling as if clinging to hope. The tomatoes were still green, but healthy. Eli had even patched the coop well enough to house 6 rescue hens Rachel had gotten from a neighboring farm. They were, for all intents and purposes, building something real. But the days were long and the work unforgiving. By the time the sun crested its highest point, Rachel would be bent double, fingers raw, back aching. Eli worked steadily, quietly, pausing only to hand her a bottle of water or adjust the brim of her hat before it blew off in the wind. He never commented on her exhaustion, but he never let her fall behind either. One afternoon, as they were dragging a hose across the far end of the garden, Rachel stopped mid-stride, swayed slightly, and dropped to one knee. Eli was beside her in an instant. "Hey," he said, his voice low but urgent. "You all right?" She nodded, but her breath came fast, shallow. Sweat trickled down her temples. "Just dizzy," she murmured. He helped her over to the shade of the porch, guided her to sit on the top step, and handed her a water jug. She drank slowly, eyes closed. "I'm fine," she said after a moment, voice hoarse. "You're pushing too hard." She opened one eye. "Isn't that the only way anything ever gets done around here?" Eli sat beside her, arms resting on his knees. "Not if it breaks you in the process." Rachel looked out at the field. Uneven rows, scattered straw, plants, leaning under the weight of the afternoon heat. "I can't afford to slow down," she whispered. "If we lose even a week, I don't know if the harvest will come in time." Eli didn't speak for a long moment. Then, "You remind me of someone." She turned to him. "Who?" "My wife, Claire." The name came out gently, like a leaf falling from a tree. She was the kind of person who worked until her hands bled, then got up the next day and did it again. Wouldn't ask for help even if her legs gave out. Rachel said nothing. "She ran a little flower stand downtown," he continued. "Said flowers were the only thing that made the town look alive. Even when her treatment started, she kept planting, right up to the end." Rachel looked down. "I didn't know." "Most people don't," he said. "I stopped talking about her a long time ago. Felt like if I kept saying her name, it would hurt worse." "Does it?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But other times, it helps. Keeps her close." They sat in the shade a while longer, neither speaking, the sound of the wind and the distant hum of insects filling the silence. "I think," Rachel said finally, "if she saw what you're doing here, she'd be proud." Eli smiled faintly. She'd probably say I'm crazy. She wouldn't be wrong, Rachel added, nudging him lightly with her shoulder. He chuckled, a warm, low sound that seemed to settle between them like a shared blanket. Later, when Rachel felt steadier, they returned to work. She insisted on finishing the compost pile, despite Eli's half-hearted protests. He watched her from the corner of his eye, still pale, still tired, but smiling now, a little more relaxed. There was something in the way she moved after that conversation. Not faster, not stronger, but steadier, like she had remembered how to breathe again. That evening, the porch became their ritual once more. Rachel brought out a bowl of sliced peaches, and they ate in companionable silence, the fruit warm from the sun, but still sweet. The sky turned gold and then dusky violet. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the leaves on the tree near the barn. Eli leaned back in his chair, boots crossed at the ankle, eyes half closed. "I never thought I'd be back on a porch like this," he said softly. Rachel looked over. "You mean after your wife?" He nodded. "After she passed, everything felt empty. Even the things I used to love, fixing things, the shop, coffee in the morning. I thought maybe the world had lost its color." "And now?" He hesitated. "Now it feels like the color's coming back, slowly, one shade at a time." Rachel smiled, not the kind of smile that bursts forth, but one that grows quietly, like the garden itself. She looked out over the land, the crooked rows, the crooked fences, the crooked lives they were building from scratch, and she felt something stir. Something like peace, something like possibility. "We're not doing it perfectly," she said. "No," Eli agreed, "but we're doing it together." She held that sentence in her chest for a long time after the words faded, and as the stars began to appear one by one above the valley, it occurred to Rachel that maybe, just maybe, it was okay for things to grow slow and crooked and human. By late July, the beans had started curling up their twine supports like they meant it. The squash leaves fanned wide across the tilled rows, soaking in every ounce of sun they could catch. Tomatoes, still green but firm, clung stubbornly in their vines. And in the far corner of the field, where the soil had once seemed nothing more than powder and memory, a shy patch of corn was rising, awkward, uneven, but alive. Rachel stood at the edge of the rows early one morning, coffee mug warm between her palms. A light fog still clung to the fields, thin and soft as breath. The world was quiet, the kind of quiet that only came when the work had begun to show its shape but hadn't yet reached its reward. She stepped carefully between the rows, inspecting, touching, whispering small encouragements under her breath. It had become a habit, half joke, half prayer. She didn't know if plants could hear, but it comforted her all the same. Eli arrived without ceremony, as he always did, pickup truck rumbling up the drive, the engine cutting out with a familiar chug. He stepped out, carrying a bucket of compost in one hand and a coil of twine in the other. "Morning," he said. Rachel tipped her mug in greeting. "You're early." "You're later than usual," he replied with a grin. They fell into step easily, beginning their morning rounds, checking irrigation lines, spotting for pests, pulling the occasional rogue weed that had slipped through, and their defenses. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. As they worked, Rachel noticed how the rows had begun to straighten, not perfect, but less chaotic than before. The field still looked like it had been stitched together by hand, but now the stitches held. Around mid-morning, they paused in the shade of the big cottonwood near the fence line. Eli handed Rachel a mason jar of water. She took it with a quiet thanks. For a while, they just sat, watching the wind move across the young corn, making the stalks sway like dancers warming up for a recital. "I keep waiting for someone to come by and laugh again," Rachel said softly. Eli raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because it feels like the part of the movie where things go wrong." He gave a half smile. "Life's not a movie. No music swells before the bad stuff." She chuckled, then grew quiet. Still, sometimes I brace myself even when nothing's wrong. Eli nodded slowly. That's what it's like when you've been disappointed enough times. Even silence starts to sound like a warning. Rachel didn't reply, but her grip on the jar tightened slightly. They spent the afternoon repairing a fence post that had finally surrendered to rot. Eli dug out the remains and set a new one, guiding it into place with slow, precise movements. Rachel held it steady, sweat dripping from her brow. I talked to my sister last night, she said almost casually. Oh? She's keeping Jonah for a little longer. Says it's better this way, for now. Eli didn't respond immediately. He drove the last nail in with a solid thunk before looking up. You okay with that? Rachel nodded, but her smile was tight. I miss him, but I don't want to bring him back to a half-finished home. Eli leaned on the hammer, studying her. You're building more than a home out here? She looked away. I hope so. That evening, Rachel wandered back out to the garden after dinner, barefoot, her dress brushing the tops of the straw between rows. The air had cooled, and the light had softened into that golden-blue hue only found in late summer. Eli was still there, kneeling near the corn patch. He'd found a few beetles and was picking them off one by one, careful not to damage the leaves. Rachel watched him for a moment before walking over. You ever get tired of fixing things? She asked gently. He sat back on his heels. Sometimes, but I get more tired of letting things fall apart. She lowered herself beside him, knees in the dirt, eyes on the growing stalks. My father used to stand right here, she said after a moment. Same corner of the field. He'd watch the wind and tell me it meant rain was coming. He wasn't always cruel, you know, just worn down. Eli looked at her, surprised by the sudden turn. He believed in this land once, she continued, but every season that failed chipped away at him, until there wasn't much left but bitterness. She reached down and plucked a single leaf from the cornstalk, turning it in her hands like a memory. I used to wonder if it was the land that cursed him, she said. But now I think he just stopped believing too soon. Eli didn't speak. For a long while, the light slipped lower, casting long shadows over the field. I see you, Rachel, he said quietly. Working this land, not giving up when it laughs in your face. That's the difference. She looked at him, eyes wide. You're not your father, he added. You don't run, you dig in. Her breath caught slightly and she looked down, blinking hard. The moment stretched. Then, without thinking, Rachel reached out and rested, her dirt-smudged hand gently over Eli's. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Just let her be there. They sat like that until the light faded into twilight and the stars began to blink overhead. Later, as they walked back to the porch, Eli paused, glancing over his shoulder at the field behind them. You hear that? He asked. Rachel tilted her head. What? Quiet, he said. But not the empty kind, she smiled. The kind that means something's growing. And in that shared quiet, among cornstalks, warm soil, and the weightless hush of healing, something else had begun to grow too. It started with the wind, strange, unsettled, rustling the corn before the sunrise. By midday, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel, and the air carried that thick, expectant stillness that only came before a storm. Rachel stood at the edge of the field, her hat clutched against the wind, eyes scanning the clouds rolling in from the west. It had been weeks since they'd seen any real rain. The soil was desperate, the plants thirsty, but storms like this didn't water, they wrecked. Eli arrived just after noon. No smile, no small talk, just a glance at the sky and a clipped, "We need to cover what we can." They worked without speaking, urgency sharpening every movement. Eli laid down tarps over the compost pile and braced the coop doors. Rachel rushed to stake the younger tomato plants, her hands trembling as she wrapped string around stems not yet strong enough to stand alone. By late afternoon, The first drops fell, heavy and sudden, not gentle nourishment, but fists pounding the earth. Rachel darted into the barn just as the sky opened in full. Eli was already there, shaking water from his jacket, hair soaked flat to his head. They stood in silence, breathing hard, watching. The rain beat down on the rows they'd built with sweat and hope. Rachel exhaled slowly, voice barely above a whisper. "If we lose it all—" "We won't," Eli said quickly. "But if we do—" He turned toward her then, and something flickered behind his eyes, something raw, like a wound that had never quite closed. "You rebuild," he said. She blinked. "That simple?" "No, not simple," he said, quieter now. "But necessary." They sat on a bench inside the barn, just far enough from the open doors to stay dry. The roar of the rain made talking feel sacred, like anything said now was carved into the very grain of the wood around them. After a long silence, Eli spoke. "I was married once." Rachel looked over gently. "Claire. We met when I was 19, fixing a generator behind the cafe she worked at. She called me Gearhead before she even knew my name." Rachel smiled faintly. "We got married young. And too young, maybe, but it worked. She was light, the kind that doesn't flicker even when the world gets dark." He paused. "She got sick about 5 years in. Breast cancer. It was aggressive." Rachel's smile faded. "I'm so sorry." He nodded. "So was I." The storm outside swelled, wind howling through the slats in the barn walls, but inside it felt still, like time had slowed. "She kept planting flowers even through chemo," Eli said. "Told me if she was going to go, she wanted to leave something blooming." Rachel swallowed hard. "After she passed," he continued, "I stopped fixing things, not officially, but inside. I'd show up at the garage, turn the lights on, go through the motions, but I wasn't there. Not really." Rachel looked at him, and in that moment, Eli wasn't the quiet, capable mechanic who showed up with tools and solutions. He was just a man, grieving, human. "What made you start again?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "A broken tractor, and a woman who refused to quit." The words hung between them, warm despite the chill creeping through the barn. Rachel looked down at her hands, calloused, dirt-lined, trembling slightly. "I think I broke something in myself when I left the city," she said. "Told myself I was coming here to start over, but I was really just running." "Running from what?" She didn't answer right away. Then, "Failure, disappointment, the kind that follows you into your sleep." Eli nodded, as if he understood exactly. They sat that way for a while, the rain relentless. Eventually, Rachel leaned her head against the barn wall and closed her eyes. "I don't know how to keep going when it feels like the world keeps pushing back," she murmured. "You don't fight the world," Eli said. "You just keep planting, even when it hurts." Especially then, when the rain finally eased into a soft drizzle, they stepped outside. The field was battered, some rows flattened, leaves torn, puddles pooling in the lowest points. Rachel stood in the mud, eyes wide, chest tight. "It's worse than I thought." Eli walked past her, knelt and scooped a handful of dirt. It oozed between his fingers, heavy, wet, but still rich. "It's not gone," he said. She crouched beside him, hands in the mud. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure it's worth trying again." That night, they didn't sit on the porch. They sat instead by Rachel's small kitchen table, nursing mugs of hot tea and speaking softly in the dim light of a single lamp. The storm had knocked out the power, but neither of them minded. Rachel glanced at Eli as he rubbed his palms together for warmth. "You ever wish you'd done it all differently?" "All the time," he said, "but wishing doesn't change what's behind us. It just steals strength from what's ahead." She nodded, letting his words settle like roots in damp soil. "You don't have to do this alone, Rachel." She looked at him then, really looked. "I know. I think I'm just starting to believe it." Outside, the sky was clearing, and in the field, beaten but not broken, the rows waited for morning. Morning came with a softness Rachel hadn't expected. The storm had swept through like a thief in the night, but dawn was gentle, mist rising from the soaked earth, the sky painted in hues of lavender and gold. A hush clung to the air, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Rachel stepped outside barefoot, her soles sinking into the damp earth. The porch boards were still slick with rain, but she didn't mind. She carried a tin of sunflower seeds in one hand and a quiet resolve. In the other, Eli was already in the field, stooping beside a row of corn that had half fallen under the storm's weight. He was lifting it carefully, bracing the stalks one by one with pieces of salvaged wood. When he looked up and saw her approaching, he straightened, gave a small nod. "Morning," he said. Rachel held up the seed tin. "I brought a little optimism." He raised an eyebrow. "Sunflowers," she explained. "Figured if they can grow facing the sun, maybe we can too." A rare smile flickered across Eli's face. "You always talk like that?" she shrugged. "Only when I'm scared." They walked together to the far edge of the field, the spot where the soil had fared best. The beans had survived, bruised but intact. The tomatoes had lost a few vines, and the corn, well, time would tell, but it wasn't a total loss. That meant everything. Rachel knelt and began poking holes in the soil with her finger, dropping one sunflower seed at a time. Eli watched her for a while, then crouched beside her, mimicking her movements. "You plant these before?" he asked. "Only once," she said. "When I was 17, behind a crappy apartment in Chicago. They never bloomed. Why not?" "I forgot to water them," he chuckled. That would do it. They worked in silence for a stretch, the rhythm of planting oddly comforting. The sun warmed their backs, the ground beneath them rich with new moisture. After a while, Rachel sat, back on her heels. "This land, it's teaching me how to stay." Eli looked at her. "Stay? I've always been the leaving kind. When things got hard, when people let me down, when I let myself down. You think staying is always better?" "I think it's harder, but maybe more honest." He nodded slowly. "My dad used to say, anyone can leave. Takes guts to tend. Something that might not bloom." Rachel smiled softly. "He sounds like a man who understood broken things." "He did," Eli said, "especially people." They moved on to the next patch, this time working together without a word. Every few feet, they paused to replant a tomato vine or reinforce a row with fresh mulch. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt sacred, like they were honoring something bigger than themselves. Later that afternoon, Rachel returned from the shed carrying 2 mismatched chairs and a weathered table. She set them up on the edge of the field, overlooking the rows they'd built, repaired, and now reseeded. "For breaks," she said. Eli raised an eyebrow. "Since when do we take breaks?" "Since now." He sat without protest. Rachel poured them both glasses of lemonade from a chipped pitcher and sat across from him. The wind played softly through the young cornstalks. The scent of wet earth lingered. "You know what I miss?" she asked, gazing out across the field. "What's that?" "Laughter. The kind that comes out of nowhere. Not forced, not nervous. Just pure." Eli nodded, quiet for a beat. "Claire used to laugh like that, said it was how she watered her soul." Rachel chuckled. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." "You would have," he said. "She didn't let fear boss her around." Rachel looked down at her glass. "I've let fear lead me for years, maybe longer than I even realized." He tilted his head. "And now?" She met his gaze. "Now I think I'm learning how to plant through it." Eli reached into the bucket by his chair and pulled out a small trowel. "Then I think you're going to be just fine." As the sun dipped lower, they sat in companionable silence, sipping lemonade, the field stretching wide before them. The wind bent the young crops gently, as if in quiet applause. And then, without warning, Rachel began to laugh. It was light at first, just a breath of sound. Then fuller, brighter, the kind of laughter that bubbles up from somewhere deep and long dormant. Eli looked at her, bemused. "What?" he asked, smiling despite himself. "I just realized," she said between laughs, "I've been barefoot, in the mud all day." Eli chuckled. "You're becoming a real farmer now." Rachel leaned back, wiping her eyes. "You ever think we're doing something crazy here?" "Every day. And you still show up." He looked at her, more serious. "Now." "Yeah, I do." She nodded, a slow understanding settling in. "Me too." As the light dimmed and the sky shifted from gold to blue, Rachel reached into her pocket and pulled out the sunflower tin once more. "Let's plant just a few more," she said, "right by the chairs, so we can watch them grow." Eli took a seed from her palm, pressed it into the soil. "For tomorrow." "For belief," she replied. And together, in the quiet of the coming evening, they planted a small circle of hope, petal by petal, inch by inch, not just into the ground, but into each other. By the first week of August, the land had changed. It didn't announce its transformation with trumpets or fanfare. There was no sudden miracle, no cinematic reveal. Just the quiet, persistent truth of greens stretching higher, roots digging deeper, blossoms cracking open under the sun's warmth. Rachel noticed it first in the tomatoes, fat and red, weighing down the vines like promises kept. Then in the squash, bursting golden and full beneath their umbrella leaves. The beans dangled like lazy commas in the morning light. Even the corn, which they'd feared lost, had rallied, patchy in places, but alive. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than enough. "Looks like we might be farmers after all," Rachel said one morning, standing beside Eli as they surveyed the rows. He folded his arms, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "You say that like you're surprised." "I think part of me still is," she admitted. "Not because I didn't want this, but because I stopped believing I could make anything good last." Eli glanced sideways at her, the sunlight catching the silver strands beginning to show near his temples. "That's the thing about the land. It doesn't care where you came from or how many times you failed. If you treat it right, it gives back." Rachel exhaled, letting that truth settle into her like fresh soil. "I needed this," she said. "More than I realized." He nodded. "So did I." That afternoon, Rachel drove into town with a small crate of produce in the back of her truck, just enough to test the waters. Tomatoes, squash, a bundle of herbs tied with twine. She parked outside Miller's grocery, heart pounding harder than she wanted to admit. Inside, Mr. Miller himself stood behind the counter. An old man with thick glasses and a reputation for skepticism. "I hear you've been growing things out there," he said as she entered. She nodded. "I brought some samples, just a few. Thought maybe someone might want fresh tomatoes without the ones trucked in from California." He lifted an eyebrow, took a tomato in his hand, turned it over like he was examining something rare. "Looks real," he said. "It is." He sniffed it, then sliced it with a pocket knife he kept by the register, popped a wedge into his mouth, chewed slowly. Then, without a word, turned around and pulled out a notepad. "How many crates can you bring by next week?" he asked. Rachel blinked. "Wait, you want—" "I'll take whatever you've got left after your own table," he said. "People will want this. They just don't know it yet." She drove back to the farm in silence, blinking against the tears that threatened behind her eyes. It wasn't about the tomatoes. It wasn't even about the sale. It was about being seen. The following weekend, the town's farmers' market reopened. It had been years since anyone had set up more than a folding table of jelly jars and canned peaches. But word had gotten around, quietly, curiously, that the old Crane farm had come back to life. Rachel and Eli arrived early, hauling baskets of produce in the back of Eli's truck. Rachel had made a sign the night before. More good things, painted on a piece of barnwood, uneven but cheerful. At first, people passed, by with raised eyebrows. Then slowly, they began to stop. A woman picked up a tomato, sniffed it and smiled. A boy begged his mother for one of the cucumbers, still slick with morning dew. An elderly man bought a bundle of basil and said, "Smells like my wife's. Getting used to." And then a familiar voice broke through the crowd. "Well, I'll be damned." Rachel turned, heartbeat skipping. It was Marla from the feed store. She stood with a paper bag of sweet corn in one hand, disbelief etched across her face. "I didn't think you'd last the month," she said plainly. "I know," Rachel replied. "You weren't the only one." Marla looked at the table, then at the small chalkboard listing prices. "Those prices are fair." "I'm not trying to get rich," Rachel said, "just trying to grow something honest." Marla gave her a slow, grudging nod. "Well, looks like you did." She walked away, without another word, but the moment hung there, strangely weighty, almost redemptive. As the sun climbed higher, more neighbors came. Some bought, some only looked, but no one laughed. Rachel glanced at Eli, who stood at the edge of the booth, arms crossed but relaxed. His eyes scanned the crowd with quiet pride. "We did it," she said, half in disbelief. Eli shook his head. "You did it." "No," she insisted. "Not without you." Their eyes met then. No fanfare, no swelling music, just a look that said more than words could. Later that evening, they returned to the farm, exhausted but glowing with the kind of tired that meant something. As they unpacked what little produce remained, Rachel paused beside the patch of sunflowers they'd planted by the chairs. They were blooming. She called Eli over, and together they stood before them. Tall, golden faces turned toward the fading. "Son, I almost didn't plant these," she said. "Thought they were too late, too fragile." "But here they are," Eli replied, facing the light. They sat in the chairs as twilight settled over the valley, the sunflowers rustling behind them like applause. Rachel leaned back, closed her eyes. "Do you ever think we were meant to fail a few times, just so we could understand what it means to keep going?" Eli nodded slowly. "Every row we planted was a kind of faith. Every one that bloomed, a kind of grace." She smiled. "What do you think's next?" He looked at her, and this time he didn't look away. "Whatever it is, I'm not going anywhere." Rachel didn't answer. She just reached across the space between them and took his hand. And in the hush of that summer evening, with the earth blooming quietly beneath them, everything felt just right. The harvest moon rose full and golden over the valley, casting long shadows across the ripened rows. It had been a good week. The market table was nearly empty by noon each Saturday, and Rachel had started receiving handwritten notes tucked into baskets. "More of those cucumbers, please," or "Your tomatoes taste like my childhood." Eli didn't say much about it, but Rachel could tell he was proud. His quiet satisfaction lived in the way he showed up 10 minutes earlier each day, or how he lingered on the porch just a little longer after the sun dipped below the ridge. But that evening, as they shelled beans together on the porch, 2 baskets between them, a breeze carrying the scent of warm earth, Rachel seemed quieter than usual. Eli noticed, but didn't press. They'd built their rhythm on silence as much as words. She stared at the horizon for a long while before speaking. "I haven't told you everything," she said finally, voice barely above the creak of the porch swing. Eli's hands paused. "Over a bean pod." "I figured," Rachel offered a crooked smile. "I thought I came here to start over, but the truth is, I came back." He looked at her carefully. "This farm," she continued, "used to belong to my father, Henry Moore." Eli froze. The name dropped between them like a stone into a still pond, sending ripples that neither could ignore. You knew him? She asked gently, already guessing the answer. Eli's voice was low, measured. Everyone knew Henry Moore. Rachel nodded. He wasn't a kind man, especially not to people who owed him money or competed with him. Eli leaned back, his eyes clouded with something distant, something buried. He once cornered my dad in town, he said. Told him he'd never make it with that garage, said no one would trust a man who fixed things instead of buying new. Rachel swallowed. He did worse than that. Eli nodded slowly. He raised prices on the parts we needed, spread rumors, tried to buy our property when my mum was sick. Cheap. Thought my dad was too desperate to say no. Rachel didn't speak. Eli stared out at the darkening fields. My father died, thinking he'd failed his family, that he couldn't provide. I'm so sorry, Rachel whispered. Eli said nothing. I didn't come here to make things right, she added. Not at first. I just needed somewhere to land. I didn't even know all of that. He turned toward her then. Why are you telling me now? She met his gaze, steady. Because this land might carry his name, but it's not his anymore. And I don't want there to be ghosts between us. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the corn in the distance. You've never treated me like you carried his weight, she continued, but I need you to know I'm not running from the past anymore. I'm facing it here with you. Eli looked at her for a long moment, searching for something maybe, a trace of deceit, or maybe just the measure of her courage. He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. You're not him, Rachel. I know. But carrying his name doesn't mean you have to carry his guilt. She let out a shaky breath, as though she'd been holding it for years. I think, Eli added, you've already started rewriting what that name means. Rachel smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. I hope so. They sat together in the quiet, the evening folding around them like a warm blanket. A cricket chirped somewhere near the barn. The sunflowers swayed gently beside the porch, their golden heads bowing in the twilight. You know, Eli said after a long pause, I think if our fathers could see us now, they wouldn't know what to make of it. Rachel laughed softly. Probably think we lost our minds. Maybe, Eli said, or maybe they'd finally understand what it means to fix something the right way. She reached over and took his hand again, like she had that night in the corn. But this time, it lingered. His thumb brushed gently across her knuckles. Used to think this land was cursed, she said, that it could only grow bitterness and bad blood. And now, she looked out at the field, the glowing rows, the stubborn corn, the beds of herbs and roots pushing deeper every day. Now, I think it just needed new hands, she said, and the right kind of rain. Eli nodded, his voice quiet. Sometimes healing doesn't mean forgetting. It just means planting something better in its place. She leaned her head on his shoulder and he didn't pull away. The swing creaked. Gently beneath them, the rhythm familiar and easy. I never expected this, Rachel murmured. Neither did I, Eli said. They sat that way until the stars came out, slow and steady, like a promise kept. No declarations, no fireworks, just two people rebuilding something old into something good. The days shortened with the coming of September. The sun no longer blazed overhead, but rather hung low and golden, casting long shadows across the harvested rows. Mornings brought mist and the quiet rustle of wind through dry stalks, like the land was exhaling after a long, hard season. The farm was quiet now, but not empty. The work had shifted. Gone were the frantic days of planting and weeding, staking and praying. In their place, sorting, cleaning, storing, preparing the earth to rest. Rachel stood at the edge of the garden with her hands on her hips, watching Eli load the last crate of preserved vegetables into the cellar. A faint smile played on her lips, equal parts relief and disbelief. Looks like we're officially out of tomatoes, she said. Eli emerged from the cellar, brushing dust from his sleeves. Never thought I'd be sad to see the last of them. You? She teased. Mr. No-nonsense mechanic? He shrugged. They kind of grew on me. Rachel laughed, then turned her gaze toward the far edge of the field, where the sunflowers they had planted late still stood tall, swaying in the gentle breeze. Their golden heads followed the light out of habit now, even as the sun dipped earlier each evening. She walked toward them slowly, Eli falling into step beside her. "You know," she said, "when I first got here, I thought this land was my burden, my penance, a place to hide while I figured out how to fix my life." "And now?" Eli asked. She looked around. The rich soil, the coop humming with healthy hens, the barn with its fresh coat of paint, the porch lined with baskets of dried herbs. "Now I think it saved me." Eli didn't respond right away. He knelt by one of the sunflowers, gently straightening a bent stem. His hands, rough and familiar, moved with quiet reverence. "I think we saved each other," he said softly. They stood there for a long moment side by side, letting the silence speak for them. Later, as twilight settled in, they carried 2 mugs of tea to the porch and settled into the chairs they'd placed months ago, back when the fields were little more than dust and dream. The sky was painted in deep blues and amber streaks. Crickets sang from the tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a sound not of fear, but of presence. Rachel wrapped her hands around her mug and breathed in the scent of chamomile. "I got a letter from Jonah's school today," she said. Eli looked over, curious. "They said he's been asking when he can come home. My sister said he drew a picture of the farm, sunflowers, chickens, even a man with a beard fixing a tractor." Eli smiled quietly. Rachel turned toward him. "I told her to bring him home next week." There was a pause. Then Eli asked, "You nervous?" "Of course," she said. "But not the way I used to be. I don't feel like I'm failing anymore. I feel ready." They sipped their tea, watching as the stars blinked alive above them. "You know," Eli said, "we never did throw a harvest celebration." Rachel smiled. "No need. Most people throw parties when they win." She looked at him. "We did win, Eli. Just not the kind of win that needs music and pie and ribbons." He nodded slowly, understanding. "So this is it, then." She leaned back in her chair, eyes on the moon rising over the hills. "This is everything." And it was, because sitting there on that porch made of old wood and new beginnings wasn't just a woman who'd returned to a broken place, or a man who had lived too long in silence. It was 2 people who had dared to believe in second chances, who had planted in dust and reaped in hope. Not because it was easy, but because they'd chosen not to give up. The neighbors still talked, but the tone had shifted. There were fewer. Snickers now, more nods. A pie left on the porch from Mrs. Grover down the road. A bag of feed dropped off with a note. "For the hens, and for the work you've done." People came to the Saturday market not out of curiosity anymore, but out of respect. Some even asked for advice on their own gardens. It wasn't just the soil that had changed, it was the town. It was the way people looked at them, with something that hovered between admiration and apology. As the evening deepened, Rachel set her mug down and pulled her knees up into the chair. "Do you think," she asked, "there's something special about this porch?" Eli smiled. "Depends." "On what?" "On whether we're here because it's comfortable, or because we built something worth sitting down for." She leaned over, rested her head on his shoulder. "I think it's both," she whispered. They stayed that way until the stars scattered wide and the tea cooled in their mugs, and the night wrapped around them like a quilt hand-stitched by Grace. No wedding bells, no big declarations, just 2 chairs, a porch, a promise, and the soft, steady peace of a harvest well-earned, not just from the land, but from the long, patient work of healing. Sometimes life gives us dry earth and rusted tools. But with kindness, with patience, and with just enough faith to plant one seed at a time, even the most forgotten places can bloom again. And in the quiet, when the sun finally sets, we may find that the greatest harvest is not what grows from the ground, but what blossoms in the heart. Where are you watching from? I'd love to know where this story found you, whether you're in a small town like ours, a big city, or somewhere in between. Drop a comment and say hi. I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale of kindness, healing, and quiet transformation. There's so much more to come. Thank you truly for spending time here today. Your presence means more than you know. Until next time, take care, stay kind, and keep believing in second chances.